It is my pleasure today to introduce Ángel Narro, who is professor of ancient Greek and Greek language and literature at the Universitat de Valencia. Ángel has also studied in Valencia, where he earned his PhD in 2013 with a thesis on the origin and development of Greek hagiography, starting precisely from the figure of Thecla. Published extensively on early Christian literature and on late antique and Byzantine hagiography, including critical editions. And he is preparing now, in collaboration, a new critical edition of the Acts of Thomas, something that we all look very much forward to. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for this kind of virtual hospitality. And thank you as well for inviting me to this seminar sessions. I'm going to share my screen. This is okay. Okay, let me check. Okay. So I think you can see right now the presentations. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. And yeah, congratulations, by the way, on the excellent organization of these seminars. So today, for our talk, I have prepared this PowerPoint presentation on Thecla's increasing authority from early Christianity to late antiquity. And this is roughly the plan we will follow in analyzing the figure of Thecla from the Acts of Paul and Thecla to later Encomia, from the 2nd to the 5th century. That is from the very beginnings of her cult to its consolidation. We are well aware of the enormous amount of scholarship on Thecla published every year, since she's a fascinating, even captivating figure of early Christian literature with important religious, philosophical, and social implications, of course. But from a literary point of view, Thecla is not a very fully developed character in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, although she is clearly created as a model for Christian women. In fact, if we read the text carefully, we find only some general characteristics without much detail. Broadly speaking, she can be described as a young noblewoman from Iconium, betrothed to a nobleman who renounces marriage after hearing Paul's preaching, converts to Christianity, suffers martyrdom for this decision, yet is preserved by divine intervention, and finally receives Paul's commission to preach the word of God. It is precisely this final element in which we will focus today, analyzing how it appears across different texts and periods as outlined on the slide. In this closing scene of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where Thecla takes up the apostolic mission at Paul's command, we witness the transfer of apostolic authority from Paul to Thecla, from a man to a woman. This was, of course, potentially problematic at the time for several reasons. On the one hand, prevailing moral and traditional prejudices against women. On the other, Paul's own views on women and their role in religious contexts, as Tertullian, for example, emphasized in the Baptismo when discussing Thecla's self-baptism. Thus, our analysis will concentrate primarily on the Acts of Paul and Thecla and its immediate context before moving on to the reception of Thecla's between the 3rd and 5th centuries. We will pause in the 5th century to consider the anonymous life and miracles of Saint Thecla, which I regard as the climax of the Thecla's cult. And finally, we will take a quick look at later texts, or rather at the titles of later texts, because maybe we won't have time for more, that praise Thecla as a prominent saint and reinterpret the content of the original Acts. Well, before beginning, I would like to recall that Paul was already a somewhat problematic apostolic figure, since he was not one of the 12 chosen by Jesus before his death. For this reason, Paul frequently asserts his own authority as an apostle in his letters. In this passage from 1 Corinthians, his definition of what it means to be an apostle is perhaps most clearly expressed. Paul writes, "For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe." As a brief reminder, it should be noted that the Acts of Paul and Thecla originally formed part of the longer Acts of Paul, but very soon began to circulate independently as a separate text. One reason for this was the self-contained structure of this section devoted to the Apostle Paul and his disciple Thecla, which can be described as a kind of pious novel. The narrative centers on two martyrdom episodes featured by Thecla, one in Iconium, the other in Antioch, which became models for later martyrdom accounts since they already display two characteristic elements: fire in the first case and wild beasts in the second. However, Thecla is not a typical martyr for three main reasons. First, she is the earliest woman in the Christian tradition to undergo such cruel trials. Second, she is extraordinary in that she enjoys a direct connection with the Apostle Paul, which grants her special authority and status. And third, she does not die in the course of her martyrdom. For the purposes of this paper, it is the second point that will be of particular significance. Thecla is presented in the text as a privileged disciple of Paul after her conversion. Paul's preaching at the house of Onesiphorus on the superiority of virginity initiates this spiritual process in Thecla, who is clearly portrayed as subordinated to Paul's knowledge of the divine word, as we can see in Acts of Paul and Thecla 18. In this passage, the text makes use of intertextuality to depict Thecla as a pious disciple of Paul, listening to his teaching at his feet, just as Mary of Bethany does at the feet of Jesus in the Gospel. If we look at both the structure and the vocabulary, we can establish a clear parallel between Luke 10:39 and this in Acts of Paul and Thecla 18. Sorry. Furthermore, Thecla is portrayed as an excellent nurse quickly. After escaping martyrdom in the theater of Iconium, when she meets Paul again, she offers a short prayer of thanksgiving to God for his providential help. The opening of this prayer, Pater hopoiesas ton uranon kaitengen, is borrowed from her master, the Apostle Paul. In Acts 4:24, he employs the same formula before the Sanhedrin after being released from prison. Despota su hopoiesas ton uranon kaitengen. Again, intertextuality plays an important role. In conclusion, this discipleship represents the first step for Thecla toward acquiring a certain authority in the eyes of early Christian communities. This authority is further reinforced by the martyrdoms Thecla endures. In the first trial at Iconium, the text describes an important scene that recalls the passage from 1 Corinthians mentioned in the third slide. There, Paul grants special status to those Christians to whom Jesus appeared, as if their experience of a divine apparition conferred a certain degree of authority to be regarded as an apostle. A similar apparition is narrated in Acts of Paul and Thecla 21, immediately before the scene in which Thecla confronts the fire in Iconium. I read just the translation of Jeremy Barrier, and having looked into the crowd, she saw the Lord sitting as Paul, ton Kyrion kathemeno hos Paulo. And she said, as if I am enduring, Paul gazes upon me. And she held fast to him, gazing intently, but he went away into the heavens. Ho de eis uranus apiei. From a martyrial perspective, this scene has often been interpreted as an instance of imitatio Christi, a common feature of this type of narrative. Alongside the symbolism of the cross, which appears in the following chapter, the text presents a classical motive in martyrdom accounts. The protection of the martyr during trials is anticipated through the apparition or presence of Jesus, as in this passage. There is no doubt that the martyrdom scenes are the most significant sections of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. They add substantial weight to the interpretation of Thecla as someone protected by God, and provided her a certain authority to spread the word of God and convert non-Christians. In fact, martyrdom frequently provokes mass conversions in this text, and this is also the case in Thecla's story, especially during her second martyrdom in Antioch, when she confronts the wild beasts. Moreover, in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the theme of imitatio Christi is not limited to echoes of Jesus' death and passion, which are indeed present, but extends further to other episodes where parallel between Jesus and Thecla can be observed. A striking example is the scene in which Paul denies Thecla in Antioch before Alexander's assault on the young woman. Once again, the text employs intertextuality to create a vivid image in the audience's mind. In this case, Acts of Paul and Thecla 26 echoes Peter's denials of Jesus in the Gospels. The linguistic formulation points to an identification of Thecla with Jesus. Paul denies knowing the woman Alexander refers to, in the same way that Peter denies knowing Jesus when questioned about his master. The parallel is especially evident in Mark 14:71, where a relative clause is used in much the same way as in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which reimagines this scene with Thecla and Paul as its protagonists. It is important to note that this scene appears in the second part of the narrative, where Thecla gradually takes on a major role in the plot and becomes step by step a kind of spiritual leader for the women around her, Queen Tryphena, her deceased daughter Falconilla, and a group of women watching her martyrdom in the arena. This leadership among women converted through Thecla's actions is clearly illustrated in Acts of Paul and Thecla 33. In this passage, one group of women approves Thecla's condemnation to the wild beasts, while another group protests and laments the unlawful act that the city of Antioch is about to commit against the young Christian woman. We can see the text with the translation from Jeremy Barrier, while others were saying, may the city be whipped out concerning this unlawful act, wipe us all out, proconsul, a bitter spectacle, evil judgment, picron theama kake crisis. The support of this second group suggests that Thecla was already perceived as a kind of spiritual leader among them. All these scenes attest to a narrative progression in the character of Thecla toward increasing authority, which reaches its peak in the Acts of Paul and Thecla with the scene of her reunion with Paul in Myra. Paul's word to Thecla, "Hypage kai didasket ton logon tu Theou," are a clear command to teach and spread the word of God, as indicated by the use of the imperative forms, "Hypage didaske." From this moment on, Thecla becomes an apostle in two different senses. First, in the etymological sense, the term apostolos, as we know, derives from the verb apostello, which can mean to dispatch someone on some mission or service, as stated in the Little Scott Jones dictionaries, and in the sense true, On this linguistic basis alone, Thecla may be considered an apostle. Second, in the theoretical sense, following Paul's sound formulation of the concept of an apostle. If Paul is considered an apostle, not one of the 12, but because God appeared to him and because of his tireless work spreading the word, then Thecla may be understood in the same way. She too experienced a divine apparition, as described in Acts of Paul and Thecla 21, endured martyrdom twice, and converted many through her actions. Accordingly, she too may be regarded as an apostle. Moreover, language is never innocent. There is an intriguing linguistic parallel in the use of the imperative hypage in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, in this case in plural, hypagete, in the scene of the clay sparrows, which have often been interpreted as a metaphor for the 12 apostles. It is significant that both texts, the Acts of Paul and Thecla and the infancy Gospel of Thomas, are usually dated to the later half of the 2nd century. This raises the possibility that one influenced the other, or that both drew on a short formula of the period to express the command to spread God's message. We can see here hypagete, petaste tejos trontes, these words pronounced by the little child Jesus to the 12 clay sparrows. The Acts of Paul and Thecla became a prominent text among Christian communities, and Thecla herself emerged as a popular figure and a recurrent model of conduct for Christian women. Between the 3rd and 5th centuries, her example was mentioned and discussed by various Christian authors. Broadly speaking, two main trends can be observed. One critical, denouncing certain elements of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, such as Thecla's self-baptism, for example, and another, more favorable, that praised her as an inspiring model for Christian women, perfectly suited to imitation. The former position is represented by authors such as Tertullian and Jerome of Estridon, while the latter was the majority view and adopted by most writers of the period who engaged with Thecla's story. The example of Thecla is frequently evoked either to praise virginity as the preferred state for Christian women, or to highlight her endurance in martyrdom for the sake of her beliefs. At the same time, her role as one of the earliest Christian heroines contributes significantly to her presence in moral writings, where she is sometimes even regarded as a near apostolic figure, an interpretation consistent with the final scene of the Acts of Paul and Thecla discussed in the previous slide. A clear example of this phenomenon appears in Gregory of Nazianzus' discourse against the Emperor Julian. In this text, the Church Father urges the Emperor to feel shame before the victims of Christian persecutions and recalls several prominent figures of early Christianity, mostly apostles. All are described as great champions, τους μεγάλους αγωνιστάς, John, Peter, Paul, James, Luke, Andrew, and Thecla, the only woman among them. Although Gregory refers to martyrdom and the hardships of persecution, the very inclusion of Thecla within this group of prominent early Christian male figures underscores her authority as a spiritual leader and her enduring role as an inspiring example. This apostolic authority becomes even more reinforced and, in a sense, unquestionable through the local cult of Thecla in Seleucia, the city where tradition located the final days of her life and her miraculous disappearance into the rocks while escaping from men who wanted to violate her. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, a major pilgrimage center dedicated to Saint Thecla has been established there. In the 5th century, when an anonymous writer connected to this shrine composed the life and miracles of Saint Thecla, the monastic complex was flourishing. This hagiographical work illustrates the remarkable growth of Thecla's local devotion. The first part, the life, is a literary paraphrase of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, while the second part, the miracles, gathers accounts of wonders attributed to her. Most of these involve healings, but others describe Thecla protecting individuals or entire cities from enemies, defending Orthodox doctrines, or offering assistance in daily life. Like other late antique miracle collections, the text has a strong propagandistic dimension aiming to spread awareness of the healings and miracles performed by Thecla at her sanctuary. For this reason, throughout both the life and the miracles, the anonymous author repeatedly underscores Thecla's authority as an apostle instructed by Paul and as a spiritual leader for Christian women. The relationship between Paul and Thecla also carried significant geographic and social implications. Seleucia was located in the same region as Tarsus, Paul's birthplace, and a rivalry between the two cities is even reflected in the text. For example, at the end of the life and in the Miracle 29, Thecla, where Thecla is said to have caused the death of Bishop Marianus of Tarsus, who had forbidden the Tarsians to attend the celebration of Thecla's feast in Seleucia. The combination of local devotion to the saint and the rhetorical skill of the author of the Life and Miracles results in a redefinition of Thecla's character, further reinforcing her authority. From this point on, she is no longer presented merely as a martyr, but as a proto-martyr, like Stephen, a new epithet that became common in referring to the saint of Iconium from this period onward. The hagiographer's reasoning is straightforward. If Stephen was the first male martyr, and is therefore regarded as the proto-martyr, then Thecla, as the first female martyr, should rightly bear the same title. I read the English translation based on my own Spanish translation of the text. So in this period, likewise, Thecla, be it not long after many other martyrs, but second, only right after the apostles and to the martyr Stephen, meta tus apostolus ca Stephanon ton martyra, who was the first to receive the word of truth, was the foremost among all women. Thus, Stephen, on the one hand, lists the men who strive for Christ and on account of Christ, while Thecla, on the other, lists the woman, tenen Thecla ton ginaikon, engaging in struggles of a similar nature. However, Thecla is not only portrayed as the female proto-martyr, but also as a female apostle, just as in the original Acts of Paul and Thecla. The main difference between the original text and the rewritten version composed by the Seleucian hagiographer lies in the vocabulary, which explicitly emphasizes Thecla's apostolic status, something less clearly articulated in the Acts. In fact, the scene of the final meeting between Paul and Thecla in Myria already contains elements pointing in this direction. As is typical of this later work, the passage is expanded, rhetorically more sophisticated, and employs both the substantive apostole and the adjective apostolikos in Paul's words. We can see here all that concerns you, young woman, is proceeding well, and in all these matters, it is the power of faith that abides in you. You have already overcome the apostolic sufferings and paths. Kaiton apostolikon ede perigegonas ponum kaidromon. Since you lack nothing to become both an apostle, apostolen, in feminine, and heir of the divine message. Go forth. We have here their command. Therefore, proclaim the word. Apithiun kai didasketon logos. Walk the evangelical path and share in my zeal for Christ. For this is why Christ has chosen you through me to lead you into apostleship. Hinase kai eis apostolen prosagageta. And to entrust to you certain cities that have not yet been catechized. For it is necessary that you increase their talents. The confirmation of Thecla's apostleships is explicitly stated at the end of the life. Here, the hagiographer explains that Thecla was entrusted with the mission of evangelizing Seleucia and its surrounding region, just as the apostles carried out their missions in other cities and countries. This explanation not only reinforces Thecla's authority as an apostle, but also highlights the historical significance of Seleucia, its region and her sanctuary within the apostolic age. In this way, Thecla's authority is also employed to legitimize pilgrimage to her shrine and to affirm its importance as a center of miracles. We can see here how the hagiographer says something like Peter in Antioch and in Great Rome, Paul in Athens, and throughout all the nations, our great theologian John in Ephesus. So just to referring to Thecla's evangelization of the Seleucia's region. Before concluding this paper, I would like to draw attention to the epithets used by the anonymous hagiographer to refer to Thecla, which appear twice in the text. First in Life 28:36, and again in the epilogue of the miracles, O Parthene kai martis kai apostole. This formula highlights the three main characteristics of Thecla: her virginity, her martyrdom, and her apostleship. Of these, the last is the one that conveys the greatest authority. Nevertheless, in both the Acts of Paul and Thecla and the Life, explicit recognition of Thecla as an apostle is far less common than the many references praising her as a virgin or a martyr. Outside the local context of Seleucia, expressing the life and miracles, it is rare to find passages that describe her in apostolic terms. Even so, two later titles of texts about her life preserve this tradition, though more for rhetorical effect than for sustained theological development. In the title of the Laudatio Thecla, erroneously attributed to John Chrysostom, the word apostolos is included in this title, Eisten hagian protomartyra kai apostolon Thecla encomion, while in the title of the brief account of her life found in the most widespread version of the Synaxarion of Constantinople, the more poetic epithet is apostolos, equal to the apostles, which have some Homeric echoes in the formation of this word, is used. These titles thus maintain the tradition of presenting Thecla as an apostle, even if primarily as a rhetorical strategy to capture the attention of the readers. In conclusion, this paper has shown how Thecla's authority is constructed in the Acts of Paul and Thecla through her close relationship with the Apostle Paul. She becomes his privileged disciple, entrusted with the apostolic mission of spreading the word of God. The main elements that Paul himself invokes to claim his own apostleship in the epistles are reemployed in the Thecla narrative to present her as a unique female apostle. Over the centuries, this authority was expanded and reshaped, especially in the context of her cult at Seleucia. The link between the saint and the city reinforced her image as a prominent leader of the earliest Christian times. The greater the authority of the city's patroness, the stronger Seleucia's role appeared in the Christianization of the region. Thus, while Thecla could already be regarded as an apostle on the basis of the primitive Acts, her fullest and most authoritative recognition came in late antiquity, when she was venerated explicitly as a female apostle. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be more than happy to answer your questions and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and instructive presentation about Thecla. We can now have a free conversation about what we've just heard. Everybody's welcome to join in the conversation at their own pace. If you would like to ask something, just wave at me or do the electronic thingy that lifts a hand. Janet has shared a document in the...
It's just in case you guys have it, it's the PDF of Andrew Jacobs' English translation of the Life of Thecla that came out recently.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it's gonna be very useful to have this, the English translation of PDFs as well.
Indeed. Madalena, did I see you wave?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Perhaps just a question out of curiosity and to have us, to start with something. So how different would you say is her depiction as a near apostolic figure? I think you put it, in comparison with other similar figures in hagiography. For instance, I know you worked on the Acts of Thomas or whatever, other figures. So how different is her depiction as a near apostolic figure in comparison with other figures?
Okay, I think it's a very difficult question because I'm not an expert on the rest of secondary apostolic figure. We were talking about Ignatius previously with Dan, for example, but in the case of these secondary characters appearing in the apocryphal acts of the apostle, we must recognize that Thecla is a unique example. I mean, there are no parallel with other women, for example, converted by other apostles that then have a developed cult or that receive specific attention, and some texts were created just for them. And from this perspective, it's a striking case, and I think this is the reason why Thecla is a fascinating figure in early Christianity, and centers all the attention of many scholars, because it's a rare case. I always thought that maybe a simple explanation, but maybe not enough to understand all the Thecla tradition, but a quite simple explanation is the structure of the text and the fortune the text has when the text started to circulate independently, because the Acts of Paul and Thecla looks actually like a novel of like a love novel. And the erotic novels this time were in fashion, were very popular, and maybe this popularity of the novel ensured this kind of spread just at the beginning. So maybe this fact made easy the rest of the tradition and the spread of the figure of Thecla in terms of just the diffusion, and also the use of typical scenes like the martyrdom scenes and so
on. Thank you. I can follow up with a different question. I know you've been looking at several texts about Thecla. I know that you're looking at not only at the oldest text, but also the later text. I think I've seen your name in the list with the volume on Metaphrastes.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to see your name there for this. One of the questions within the project, after we've sorted out all the problems with the manuscripts and all the relationship between the text, one thing is that for each character that is lucky enough to get several texts about them, the character migrate. Some features are kept to make that character recognizable, others are dropped. New things are added in the meantime. Those can be stories or lines of dialogue. Some of them are like, how do I say, incremental. They don't add anything new. But other things that are added in other texts, like add new depth to a character, in terms of characterology. They make it less unidimensional. How does the migration of Thecla look between these texts from your perspective, having looked at these texts?
Yeah, so in my opinion, and it's just an impression, because we have we should examine very carefully all these texts inside this tradition. But in the case of Thecla, it's very regular, because in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, we have three main characteristics. So Thecla presented as a virgin, as a martyr, and as an apostle at the end of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. But the latter element is mostly ignored by most of of the writers or the theologians dealing with Thecla and mentioning her example. Thecla normally is praised by her virginity and by being the first martyr. Like this title of proto-martyr then will be very used in all along the tradition through the Byzantine times, and it will be maybe the epithet or the preferred title for naming Thecla inside this hagiographical tradition. Normally, and it's something that I'm seeing also in the case of Thomas, for example, as you mentioned, the text used to concentrate in just a specific part of the narrative, or on some aspects building the character of the text. And in the case of Thecla, I say as a virgin and as a martyr, because as a wonder worker or a miracle performer is rather in the context, always in the context of Seleucia, and it's just in the life and miracles. But this text is very tricky because it was written by an anonymous hagiographer, someone who knows very well the Greek rhetoric, and someone who had a great literary pretension. So the rhetorical exaggeration, it's something that we have to consider when we face this text, because it's not just a kind of encomium. It's just not just an innocent rewriting of the acts of Paul and Thecla, but he has specific purpose.
Very, very interesting. And so you would say, do I understand correctly, that in a way, so she gains authority as things go in late antiquity, but she loses traits, becomes like something slightly simplified.
Yeah, Thecla gains authority until 5th century, and especially in the context of Seleucia. But then we have to consider that Thecla has or had already a certain authority for being just the female proto-martyr. And this is the way in which she will be considered later in the Byzantine tradition as a virgin and as a martyr, mostly. But as a martyr, always accompanying Paul, which is also interesting. And this is what confers also this authority, being a disciple of Paul.
So that gets always carried with the new tasks. Have you had the chance to look at the metaphrastic text? I haven't yet. So I'm curious. We get an editor, he's transforming things, rewriting, stabilizing the text stylistically, normalizing it stylistically. Does it drop stuff?
The main elements are preserved. Obviously, the expression changes, even if sometimes he keeps literacy, which is interesting because, for example, in the life of Thecla, the author tends to reformulate all the expression. We can find just, I think, I found just 4 or 5 expressions that appear literally in the acts of Paul and Thecla. But in the case of the metaphrases, we found more expressions literally taken borrowed from the acts of Paul and Thecla, even if they are very short. So it's the metaphrastic style. I mean, we can define roughly the metaphrastic style as the mixing between a new Byzantine expression with the ancient formulation of the text, more or less. it would be. So we can find this precisely this kind of thing. But normally in the metaphrastic versions, the main elements are always preserved. So we can find the martyrdoms, we can find all the conversion of Thecla, even we can find, if I don't remember bad, most of the Macarisms, of the blessings appearing at the beginning of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So the main core of the narrative is preserved, but what changes, it's really the expression.
They're very, very interesting. Janet, please.
I have a couple of different questions, but I guess, okay, so one thing I'm curious about is if you've looked at all at, I think it's probably Stephen Davis or somebody who mentions that Thecla becomes a very popular name that appears in epigraphy and,
Yeah.
you know, so is there any evidence there that, and I was sort of thinking about this in terms of what you said about Thecla serving as a model for Christian women, and in what sense model, and who is naming their daughters Thecla, and then what are those Theclas growing up to do? And my impression is that a lot of them are growing up to be mothers. So in what sense is, or do you know what I mean? Like, I'm just wondering if that type of evidence can give us any sense of how actual Christians in these various centuries are thinking about Thecla as model.
Yeah. So about the question of the names, which is very, very interesting, and the statistics of Stephen Davis are marvelous, because are very, very enlightening about how at a popular dimension Thecla works as a very popular name, not only in Egypt, because he registered all the statistics in Egypt, but also in different countries. For example, in Spain, in Tarragona, we also have an inscription of a nun called Thecla, coming from Egypt, probably creating a monastic center in Tarragona. The question of Thecla as a model in late antiquity is very complex, because Thecla is not only a model for virgins, not only a model for martyrs, but also for people trying to live in celibate or in a monastic context. Because we can see also in the later additions to the life of Thecla, or better, to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, appearing in the 3rd, 4th centuries, more or less, in which Thecla spent the rest of her life in Seleucia, in a cave, carrying monastic life and so on. So Thecla became also an example for the development of a certain female monasticism. And this is interesting, because maybe people tend to call their daughters Thecla because of that, and because they, I don't know, they wanted their daughters to become monks, or just as a pious name, pious Christian name in fashion of that time. But it's definitely a very good point, and it will be great to have more documents, more epigraphy with this kind of information, and maybe in other cases can be also of help. I mean, not only in the case of Thecla, but also in other for other cults of the apostles, or these secondary figures can be of interest, registering all and checking out all this epigraphic material. And I don't know if I answer all your questions, Janet.
Yeah, so that was great. I have more questions if if there's no other hands. Okay, so my other question is about something that you said sort of early on, and not so much the primary point of the paper, but when thinking about the relationship of the Acts of Thecla to canonical sources, and especially that quotation, the ha poiesis ton uranan kai tengain. So recently, Remy Gounel published a paper in Novum Testamentum about apocryphal acts and canonical acts. And one of the things he suggests is, first of all, that canonical acts was not nearly as popular as we sometimes imagine it might have been, and that it's entirely possible that authors of apocryphal acts don't even know canonical acts, forget about whether they're trying to hate or whatever, which I think is a sort of interesting idea to think with. But you convinced me here that the Acts of Thecla might be among apocryphal acts one of the more canonical texts. Do you know what I mean? A text that has more intertextuality, canonical sources, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I was wondering if you'd thought, I don't know, if you have more to say on that topic.
Yeah, I always expected a kind of connection between the Acts of Paul and Thecla and the canonical text in general, not only the Acts but also the Gospel. And I think it's clear if we take a look at the language, because normally the linguistic analysis it's forgotten in the analysis of the apocryphal acts and just concentrated on the links of some formulations or words. But in this case, the text goes further, because the text is playing with certain echoes and playing with language. And it's important to note that the context of that time. We are now living in a literary context, in a context in which we can read everything, and everything can be registered, and we have the opportunity of checking always this our text, our material. In early Christianity was not the case, and these texts were circulating also in an oral form. And it's important, the words, because they have a different ability for memorizing text and for keeping in mind what is important and what is not important. And from this perspective, this kind of formulations and this kind of intertextual game between the canonical text and the Acts of Paul and Thecla proves that there is something there. It must be, because the use of identical formulation, the use of identical words must mean something. It's not casual. I mean, we cannot believe in this kind of casualities. And it's very clear, for example, in the case of the denials of Peter and the denial of Thecla, but also in different cases, as for example the first martyrdom in Iconium, the comparison, the parallel between the episode of the three young Hebrew, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego of the book of Daniel is very clear. I mean, and the text also use the same exact words as in the book of Daniel, in the case for referring that the fire cannot touch the body of Thecla. So, and it is something that in this case precisely is evident, and it's not only evident for us, but also was evident for the people dealing with the texts. Because if we go to the 3rd, 4th centuries, the fathers of the church were mentioning Thecla as a martyr, as an example of perfect martyr even. They mention how this was exactly the same situation that suffered the three young Hebrew at the oven of because of the king Nabucodonosor and so on. So we can find the answer of our question there. So this intertextuality plays with the text of the New Testament, the canonical text, but also with sometimes with Old Testament texts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I think Madalina has on. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. So I have a question about the geographies and a bit about this idealized geography. So because she was from Iconium, and then she traveled to, I mean, with Paul to Antioch, settled then in Seleucia. So we have all these idealized geographies.
Yeah.
So can we see how these geographies, so these idealized geographies function in building up her cult, or perhaps sustaining her cult? Or can we develop a bit more on
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, of course. In the case of Thecla, it's very clear, because in Seleucia, where her cult was developed, is because this tradition of placing precisely in Seleucia at the end of her life, and then this tradition was developed in several texts, because we can find, for example, first tradition or first variant of the legend that Thecla disappeared into the rocks and then reappeared in Rome and died in Rome. Then that entered into the rocks and then passed away, something like this. And in the Life and Miracles, the hagiographers says textually that Thecla entered into the rocks, but living. I mean, she was alive. And the impression that you have when you read the Life and Miracles, especially the Miracles, is like if Thecla was alive, performing the miracles, but in a very vivid way. So her apparitions are not described as just as a phantom or an epiphany. Sometimes, perhaps, it's close to this kind of apparition, but other times it's just described as if she was just alive, running through the monastery, meeting people, talking with them, and so on. But geography definitely plays a special role. And actually, in Seleucia there is a funny story, because we can find in the 4th, 5th century, maybe in the 6th, the monastery of Thecla, the Thecla shrine, was very active in this region. Then we have this Arabic invasions and other people coming there, and Seleucia became a city between frontiers and a disputed city between different populations. And then in the Middle Ages, it seems that a certain cult for Thecla is also reintroduced in this city under the Armenian kingdom of Seleucia in the, I think it's the 12th century. I'm not a historian, sorry, and I cannot be very precise with the dates, but it has an explanation, and it has a connection also with Spain. And it's because the king of the Little Armenia, whose capital was Seleucia, sent in the 12th, 13th century a relic of Thecla to Spain, to Tarragona. And this relic was an arm. And the existence of this relic contradicts the late antique tradition of Thecla disappearing and being alive, because we have to read between the lines and assume that there was no tomb of Thecla in the 5th century. There was just a cave in which people thought Thecla was disappeared. But in the 13th century or 12th century, more or less, this tradition was lost. So Christian people from Seleucia in this period didn't know this tradition. And even the king of this Little Armenia sent to the king of Aragon the arm of Thecla, and also a Latin version of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, not the Life and Miracles of Paul and Thecla, that maybe was unknown at this time in Seleucia, or in the context of Seleucia, but a Latin version of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, based on maybe on an original Greek. So geography plays definitely a role. And in the case of Thecla, it's also interesting this rivalry between Tarsus and Seleucia, maybe because of having a predominant position in the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem also.
Very interesting. We can afford one more question if someone wants to jump in at the last moment. Otherwise, I'm gonna. Oh, Madalena, please.
Well, perhaps if we have time, I can have some other question. You mentioned, I think towards the end, something about the concept of is apostolos. So can you develop a bit more on that? So I know that
It's a
the
it's
term
a
is used for some.
in this case it's just a term that appears only related to Thecla in the title of the short, the abridged version of the Axopol and Thecla, included in the most widespread version of the Synaxarion of Constantinople, which will be then mixed with the Greek Menaion and kept until today in the liturgical Greek Synaxarion. But it is curious because this adjective, it's so the formation of this adjective, it has some Homeric echoes, because this isos plus a substantive was typical from the Homeric diction. For example, we have the word isotheos or something like this, like equal to the gods, refer to different heroes, and this is a poetic creation added to these titles for Thecla to reinforce precisely this authority and maybe to capture the attention. Because then this kind of apostolic element is not very well developed in the text. I mean, it is curious. They only use this. It's the same case as in the encomium attributed to John Chrysostom. We find this apostolos in the text, but then there is no mention. There is no consideration of Thecla as an apostle in the text. So it's maybe a rhetorical strategy to capture the attention of the reader and to give more honors to the saint in the title.
Before concluding, I have a very quick question, and that comes from the perspective of our project here in Vienna. It's so the martyrdom, the texts about Thecla are among in our corpus by far. I think it's the most copied in Greek, by far, and even when compared with the other side of our corpus, the corpus where these characters that have met the apostles become authors, it is still Thecla and the text about Thecla that is copied more than, I don't know, Ignatius. But Ignatius and others have a voice, authorial voice. We get people writing under the name of Ignatius until well in the Middle Ages. And in several languages, other things, not always letters. You get canons, very, very strange things going on. So my closing question would be, from your perspective, why don't we have anything written under the name of Thecla?
Interesting. I think it's a very, very difficult question. Frankly, we cannot know. I have some ideas. Maybe because Thecla was not a real character. That's the first idea. I mean, Thecla is, in my view, is clearly idealized character. So maybe it existed someone called Thecla that maybe played a role and had some relationship with Paul or something like this, but from the perspective of the text, it's a literary character, and maybe this is why we don't have any other writings attributed to Thecla, even if we could reconstruct somehow some of her prayers, for example, as it appeared in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, or we have also these prayers created by the 5th century hagiographer of Seleucia, in which Thecla has a voice, but it's an imagined voice. I mean, it's not real, because what this hagiographer did is just an exercise of school. It was just a metaphrasis, and so it was imagined how Thecla was speaking or thinking, and how she maybe pronounced a prayer or something like this.
Did you see those prayers circulating separately?
No, I think no. Normally they circulated inside the text, so never in a separate form, which is also curious.
Nearly there, nearly that we end up with her as an author. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And on this sunny note, I would like to thank our speaker today and everyone in the room.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
See you next time.